though, is that if you basically, oh, here's another graph starting. This is a group that's it's classifying. It's going earlier and going up to age 18. Before age 3, it's very difficult to get measures of cognitive ability. But what we see is we look at maternal education, and then we look at children. This is a study that I've done with Jean Brooks Gunn and some other people, and we follow these to age 18. We see that already at age 3, substantial gaps. Certainly by age 5, before they're really entering the formal school system, we're getting substantial gaps, and those gaps are pretty persistent to age 18. So most of the story and these abilities that are so predictive of a later success are opening up at early ages before age 5. So that's, I think, quite important. And if you look also at non-cognitive skills, now here's the scores. The scale is in reverse order. But what you see is that people who are at the very top of the income distribution have the lowest rank in terms of behavioral problems. So a low score here is a good thing. So kids from advantaged families have low behavioral problems, and those from the most disadvantaged families, high behavioral problems. And again, here we're going back to age 4. Those problems are emerging at a very early age, so that the gaps open up. And I can give you literally scores of these graphs, not just all done by me. These are from various data sources and by other people. And so what we also know, and this is purely a statistical relationship now, it doesn't have causal status, but nonetheless, if we adjust for things like early family background, this is the same graph I put up in terms of the math score. If we adjust for family background, what do we see? We see that actually just a simple adjustment for things like mother's ability, mother's education, early measures of family environment, we don't completely eliminate the gap, but we close a lot of it. So there's a lot of adjustment downward. And that's suggestive, and I want to suggest that external evidence that promotes it. And the same thing you get for the for the behavioral index, you're adjusting it up. And there are gaps in health, and I'll skip over that. They're quite important. Now, why is this so interesting? Well, first of all, it suggests then that these problems, the ability is predictive, the gaps in abilities are opening early up, and they seem to be related to family status. Why we should be concerned is that there is a lot of evidence, as I said earlier, that more children, relatively more children, are being born into disadvantaged families. And what we've learned is that, in fact, if anything, a source of inequality that promises to perpetuate itself across generations is opening up. Demographers call this the Great Divide. And so what we're actually seeing is a phenomenon where those in more advantaged environments are receiving more. So it's a very peculiar phenomenon. More women who are educated are working than ever before in the US economy. Those women, when we study their input into child development, are actually spending more time in child development than ever before. So even though they're working more, they're also spending more time. Why? Because they read Newsweek, they read Time, Hillary Clinton takes a village story. There are lots of, so there's the educated women are doing it. So simultaneously, educated women are earning more, they're spending more time with their kids, even though they're working more. So you're getting this concentration. Now, you're not getting a comparable increase at the bottom end. So what's happening is the disadvantage, those kids from more advantaged environments are receiving more, those from less advantaged environments are not. So let me just give you some rough idea about the American experience. But the fact is, this documents the notion that more children are growing up in disadvantaged homes. And what we see is a tremendous change. That if we look at trends in mothers' median education, that we see that the highly educated women, college graduates, are increasingly having their children at later ages. And that has increased a bit for the less educated women. For those who are at the bottom, you know, the educational distribution, the dropouts and the like, you're not seeing much change. So again, women are postponing pregnancy, having fewer kids, and there's a huge gap. So, and this is just showing the employment trend. If we look at the trend, we see this huge growth, that many more women who are highly educated are increasing. The labor force participation rate in 2000 is over 60%, and it's grown tremendously since 1960. And it's grown much more for the most educated groups. And for less educated, it's increased, but less so. And trends in single motherhood. This is something that can be very sensitive when you talk about family environments. If we ask, where do we see the biggest growth in single parenthood, it's clearly among the less educated women. So this is not the Murphy-Brown effect or anything. If you look at highly educated women, the percentage of educated women having children out of wedlock, it's a positive percent, but the trend is, it's kind of trendless. But if we look at less educated women, it's been going up. So these are measures of disadvantage. I won't beat you to death with all these statistics. They're quite interesting, but I won't. So what we've learned is that early factors are very powerfully predictive of later success or failure. There's some recent work by two people at the Kaiser Health Center in California, Folletti and Anda. And they do something which essentially revives some of the early ideas of Freud. They have long-term longitudinal studies in which they look at the effects of adverse early experience on human development. So let me just show you what they do. There's something which they call the ACE study. It's the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, and it shows how early adverse childhood, so they have longitudinal data on cohorts of people born starting back from the turn of last century. They follow them into life, and they can see what the effects are of adverse childhood experiences. Now these are not experiments, these are basically correlational results, and they do have some problems associated with them. In a sense, some of these are retrospective results, but they have ways of confirming this. So let me just show you some ideas. I showed this to a Freudian psychologist at Chicago, and he was amazed because Freud didn't have a lot of data in his studies, and Folletti seems to have this. So just to summarize the Folletti data, Folletti has something called an ACE score, which is adverse childhood experience. So a 0 score means you haven't had any adverse family experience, and 5 or more is a lot of these adverse experiences. And so there are a lot of adverse, so we get a distribution. Only 33% don't have any adverse experience. So if you look, for example, at what the consequences are, and these now are just simple increases in odds ratios. This is telling you what the increase is, how ACEs increase the likelihood of a heart disease, and we can see emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and the like. These factors have profound and lasting effects on adult conditions. If we look, for example, at alcoholism, adult alcoholism, we can see a very clear ranking between the ACE score, a high ACE score, which is a bad environment, in adult alcoholism, drug use, antidepressant prescriptions, sexually transmitted diseases. So we get basically a series of evidence that suggests, as Freud was suggesting, maybe even more dramatically than Freud was suggesting, that early environments are very powerfully predictive. So that kind of corroborates what's been in the literature for a long time. And then again, to draw on some work by Bruce Perry, I'll just show you one graph from him, and this is one that's widely cited. These are studies of so-called Romanian infants. This is shown all around the world in this study. Here you see cross-sections of children at the same age. These are 3-year-old kids. The Romanians ran another kind of social experiment, maybe even more pathological, in the girl dog study in the Ukraine, which is only on one person. Ceausescu actually had a policy, and the policy was basically Greater Romania. All girls, all women were basically forbidden to have birth control. They weren't had any control. They were supposed to have more and more children. But to ease the burdens, the children were placed in orphanages. And so what happened was a whole cohort of Romanian infants were placed in these orphanages, and then we're growing up. And then when the regime fell, there was a whole spectrum of people of various ages who had been in these orphanages for many, many years. Some just had entered the orphanage. And they could be taken from the orphanage. You can see how much you could undo the damage. So it's kind of a natural experiment. And there were studies done in England and Canada and the US. What this shows is a kid who grew up in the orphanage. This is literally a cross-section of a human brain. So what you see is gaps in the development. So literally the skull is smaller, the brain development's smaller. I mean, these aren't the same kid, obviously, so I'm not really comparing the same person.